Now in Genshin, we have already been introduced to Xbalanque through Nouvelette's drip marketing with the title One Entombed with a Primal Fire. Many of you might have been thinking that he's the Pyro Sovereign, but I think that Xbalanque is just a... Natlan has become the hot topic. And of course, when there are hot topics, there are also hot takes. Many are already making theories about how Natlan is gonna unfold, but hopefully for this one, I could convince you guys that I cooked. I don't think you guys will be cooking me instead for my spicy theories, right? Welcome one and all to the fourth and so far the longest episode of Deep Dive, where we dive deep into realizing what are those things that we fight for. You know, you could be fighting for Primo Gems and giveaways to get a shot at pulling for the Pyro Archon, or you could be fighting with people on Reddit to feel good about being right. But don't fight with each other over whether Capitano wins or Mavuika hands him the L, because for one, we'll be exploring the essence of battles and war in what looks like a well-anticipated grand tournament. At this point, things were different in how much source we have in speculating about Natlan. Some of you guys were thinking it's going to be a grim, dark, crimson-hued region, but what we got from the teaser was vibrant colors and groovy music. Well, that one's unexpected, huh? But that got me thinking, what if these colors, or rather the colorful display of Natlan, were to hold heavy significance to its potential story? As you could recall from the Travail trailer, dainsleif mentions in the Natlan preview that the rules of war are woven in the womb. The victors shall burn bright while the losers must turn to ash. This part of the quote might have just given us hints on how the simple visual accompaniment of colors would be vital to the many converging themes of Natlan. As you see, Genshin in itself is already pretty colorful. You identify characters based on their elements, and these elements have their corresponding colors. Like for Pyro, you have the color red, in which similar tones and hues of red were used for characters who wield the Pyro element. And going back to the 4.7 Natlan preview teaser, we saw the showcase and the symbols of the 6 different tribes, and 3 of them were featured. The colored symbols were then shown to be of yellow, green, and blue, in which they correspond to the respective color-coded elements that we have in the game. We also saw different Saurians that correspond to these colored symbols, and based on the colors and the abilities of the featured Saurian, we could instinctively know that those symbols are tied to the elements Geo, Dendro, and Hydro. So these tribes are possibly tied to the elements or the Saurians, but I don't think it's constructed in a way that the people in Natlan would just choose the tribe based on what element or Saurian they resonate with. I mean, if that was the case, they could just switch tribes if they don't resonate with the one they're born into. It's likely that a specific factor of choice would allow them to pay a trip outside of Natlan, making it a possibility where we could have encountered NPCs from Natlan. But at the same time, it does not look like they didn't have a choice in being in Natlan, as we get to know from an NPC in Beta Harbor that its population is energetic, and that they love street graffiti, showing off, and comparing fashionable trinkets. With the Ignition teaser being released, I was left in awe with how flamboyant Mavuika was. I mean, her entrance was bombastic. I definitely say Hoyoverse cooked on this one. But with that being said, it's a likely conclusion that the reason why people in Natlan don't bother leaving their nation nor bother associating with a different tribe is because they were born with an innate sense of pride, which, in my opinion, fits the tribal motif of the region. These tribes also have different rules, apart from the different colors and Saurians, as if their cultural diversity is what makes up the region. And honestly, I already think that Natlan might as well be our most culturally diverse region in Teyvat. Although I was among the people who expected Natlan to look like a grim war-torn place, I'm slowly starting to realize that Hoyo is definitely cooking up a lot more real shit here. You see, if you had that sense of belonging at the start of your life, you would be molded into the culture that you were integrated in. As you grow up, you develop a sense of community where you take part in activities, celebrations, mutual partnerships, and fellowships. Some families are like this. Children grow up to look after their parents as they continue their line. Even in citizenship, some people are openly proud about their heritage. Natlan is no different. It is likely that people in Natlan show off mainly out of their tribal pride, and whatever rule their tribe has established, people that are part of it would also embody those rules. So if there are tribes of different rules, colors, and Saurian coexistence in Natlan, Natlan won't be championed just like all the other regions with citizens falling under the culture of their own nation. Natlan people would have diverse identities, and in that difference, they make up a colorful region. This would be the rules of war that are woven in the womb, and would also be what it meant when Adele said that their souls are forged for battle from birth. We could say here that Natlan's perception of war isn't about taking over or invading or settling territorial disputes, but instead they view war as a way to represent the wonders of their tribes and identities. Ladies and gentlemen, we got a region that is pretty much rainbows and sunshines, at least for now. We know Hoyo is good at pulling these deceptive strings in their Genshin teasers. You thought Arlecchino was the evildoer in Fontaine? Well, psych, she just helped us pick up stones, that's all. But there are more to these colors in regards to the concept of war in Natlan. If we go back to Dainsleif's quote, he said, "The victor shall burn bright." So that got me thinking, if people in Natlan partake in war given their differences and competitive spirit, then emerging victorious would mean exalting their identity, making their presence burn brighter, and in a simple term, it would be brightening their colors. And we have seen how Genshin symbolically makes use of the glimmering, sparkling, and brightening of colors predating back to Inazuma, where the visions embedded on the statue of the omnipresent god started lighting up when the resistance forces initiate a charge after Kazuha parried the Muso no Hitotouchi. When colors light up, it's usually tied to the fulfillment or the realization of will. It's a hopeful type of visual cue that implies some sort of a momentum to whoever triggers or associates with it, which can be seen when the traveler was able to defeat A in their second duel. The plain of Euthymia brightened with the ambition of the people in Inazuma. Similarly, visions light up when their rightful owner's will gets realized. In the case of the masterless vision that belonged to Kazuha's friend, not even the traveler could reawaken the vision. It was only until Kazuha mustered his bravery to challenge the Muso no Hitotouchi that the masterless vision lit up. It was at that moment he was able to fulfill the remaining will of his friend, the desire to brave the lightning's glow. Now, if we go back to Dainsleif's quote, the phrase extends to, "Well, the losers must turn to ash." And we've had quite a number of instances where ashes were used in Genshin. The first obvious one is Wanderer, where in the Ashes teaser, it opens up with that time Scaramouche recounting the burning sensation and the feeling of his skin being on fire, following the defeat against the Traveler and Nahida. Then the young friend of Scaramouche tells him a narrative that reflects on his overall character motif, being a discarded puppet with a desire to have a heart. He would be that puppet soldier, that similar puppet that burned to ashes and leaving behind a heart. With his defeat and those burning sensations, guess what followed? It's his rebirth as Wanderer, where over the course of time, he develops more human characteristics as opposed to an ice-cold cynical puppet. And I think it's worth pointing out that the young friend and Scaramouche had different interpretations of the narrative ending. Scaramouche envisioned it as a heart in the shape of ashes and not being real, while the young friend interprets it as hearts being born from ashes. Now question, we know the latter represented the remake of Scaramouche into Wanderer, but what would Scaramouche's initial interpretation represent? Well, the thing about his interpretation is it's pretty much more literal than the figurative insight of the young friend. Not saying that Scaramouche is dumb to read between the lines, but when you're already at extreme points of devastation, you know it's pretty hard to think brightly and to cling to hope, which I believe foreshadows the essence of losing in Dainsleif's quote about Natlan. This same quote can also be traced back to Nahida's homecoming quest, and to be exact, this quote came from Apep. She followed by saying that even after the death of the Dragon King, they didn't give up on finding a way to turn the tides of their war against the heavenly principles. They thought of a way to defeat them that makes use of forbidden knowledge, only to be stopped by the divine nails. In a world where the heavenly principles earned victory and the right to reshape it, the dragons seem to stand no chance. But regardless, they still yearn to retake what's theirs, and we are seeing tiny bits of progress from the Fontaine Archon quest where Fusalo returned the rightful authority to New Villette, without having yet to awaken the heavenly principles. Going back to Apep, the weekly boss we fight over there isn't really Apep, but the guardian of the oasis, and it is still worth paying attention given the stark differences of colors when we fight this weekly boss. Notice that when we first fight this boss in the story quest, it appears with lifeless olive green color schemes that when you compare it to the color of Nahida and the Denjo element, it appears murky as if the element of Denjo is losing its color and getting mixed with ashes. It also comes with the narrative of reviving the heart of the oasis and ushering the elemental life forms back to their home, back to Apep. after which it regains its color to that of emerald green, as pristine and concentrated as the element of dendro. So if the brightening of colors would represent victory, then the darkening of it would represent defeat, which makes sense since ashes of grayscale colors, the colors that would then be devoid of the vibrance that Natlan has. We see this type of ash-like color in the Visionless Traveler and the Masterless Vision during the Inazuma prologue quest. In case you didn't remember, it was where we first encountered Kazuha, who then at that time was looking for someone who could reawaken the Masterless Vision that once belonged to his friend. So as a way to search for that worthy person, Kazuha with Beidou held the Crux Clash, a visionless martial arts tournament where its winner will not become visionless anymore. But unfortunately, not even the Traveler could light it up at the end, and it was Kazuha himself who braved to fulfill his friend's dream that he made it light up again. Wait, hold on. Tournament? Didn't the Ignition teaser have a tournament as its focal subject? Coincidence? I think not. What if I tell you that this is actually one of the many foreshadowing of Natlan's war? It has already been displayed to us among the many battles of the Traveler. We could have already known about the specific nature of war. Out of these three examples that set the foundation for Ashes, they have one thing in common. Wanderer, since the beginning of his lore as Scaramouche, already sets his aim towards obtaining a heart, but as it turns out, his 3 betrayals warped his view on what having a heart means. Apep longed to reclaim her authority on behalf of the 7 sovereigns, only to be corrupted by the forbidden knowledge. While yes, overthrowing the rule of the heavenly principles was the sovereign's goal, they were the first to inherit the elements. It was their birthright. It has been woven in the womb. Then there is also the Masterless Vision, which didn't light up for its new master despite Kazuha's attempts, because it turns out that there is not anyone who could realize the exact ambition of his friend, not even the Traveler. Among these specific events, I suddenly saw their interconnection with the idea of true purpose, or rather, true intention. And I've been wondering that Genshin always has been this exceptional in its wordings and metaphor, at least in English, but localizations are quite different. Man, if only I could learn Chinese fast, I could have had a blast in deciphering its original intended lore. Because speaking of intention, we see this being mentioned in the Agnetus Agate Gemstone, wherein it quotes, "A pilgrimage for a wish, a battle to earn a name, burnt to cinders for a dream. If the intention yet remains, achieved truth he has." Just a refresher, these quotes in the Agate Gemstones have been pointing towards the Archon's approach to their respective ideals, as well as their known character motifs. In our case right now, we are looking at the Pyro Gemstone that foreshadows the Pyro Archon's ideal of war. And although I know for myself that I'm not particularly fond of nitpicking punctuations or grammar mistakes, this quote got me intrigued with the use of the semicolon. You know, there are certain phrases that change meaning depending on where you put the punctuations. Like for example, don't skip citlali and don't skip citlali. Depending on where you put the exclamation point, you could be delivering the intended or the opposite message. But I'm not really all about the placements of the punctuations because here, the semicolon has quite the remarkable use. Just so you know, semicolons are generally used to connect two independent clauses, but it also has that implied function that expounds the context of the latter clause, a function that is not often present in commas. Going back to the Agnetus Agate Gemstone quote, the semicolon was placed after the phrase, "a pilgrimage for a wish." Initially, this got me confused because I mistook the semicolon for a comma, but since it is indeed a semicolon, my theory has gotten clearer. The pilgrimage could be a reference to Tenoch in the Talking Stick lore, where he quote-unquote belongs no longer to any tribe, traversing the rugged wilds where dragons roamed, that wilderness of hot springs and lava. The wish could then point towards his burning fury, remaining unquenched as he gazed upon the sight of a turbid black tide. Further down the Talking Stick lore, these different tribes were too preoccupied with their conflicts to even care about what Tenoch had encountered from the horizon, so he assembled 6 allies from the different tribes as they fought against the encroaching black tide, while the excerpt ends inconclusively. But it's not to say that the pilgrimage for a wish is only for Tenoch or the Talking Stick lore. Rather, I think this represents every person's life journey in Natlan, with their wishes being their reason to battle. And I believe that this wish is their birthright. It's what forges them for battle. It's the general context that gets expounded on in the next clause, being a battle to earn a name, burnt to cinders for a dream. You know how I talked about how Genshin's word selection has been remarkable? Well, guess what? They are also not just playing with closely associated words and making them appear synonymous in context. Battle and war, name and color, cinders and ashes. Well, I guess there's still an underwater volcano that we gotta deep dive into. Let's start with the main point I wanna make here. This specific quote is pretty much a rephrasing of victors burning bright and losers turning to ash. And in fact, this could even potentially explain a lot more about the nature of triumphs and defeats. If the pilgrimage for a wish would pertain to their birthright and their reason for battle, earning a name would be the acknowledgement and realization of that reason. Kind of like a champion belief, where you would uphold a belief and clash with others over which belief would reign supreme. Also, what could be the other meaning when we say the word name? Ah, of course. Identity. You could say I became Nahida because I committed to memory my mentions of Wanderer. But I have this ironic hot take that despite him losing to the Traveler as Booer's first sage in their battle, he still managed to emerge victorious by attaining his core personal intention, having a heart. But earning a name in a literal sense already holds value of significance because it was us, the Traveler, who gave him a name and even a new identity. Not Nahida, it was us, the same person who defeated him in the fight. Metaphorically, this would mean that name, not necessarily in a literal sense, is something that can be inherited or passed down from previous victors to the next ones who would emerge triumphant. This inheritance could perhaps be what the tribes are fighting over. As the rules of war are woven in the womb, this inheritance could also be a contested objective that has something to do with said rules. Heavenly principles reshaping the world, different tribes having different rules, the coveted authorities of the 7 sovereigns, we now have 3 additional major puzzle pieces that would inch us closer to the truth of war. Now, speaking of war, dainsleif implied this to be recurring as it has already begun, and it's just a continuation of past battles. Backtracking to the Ito event a few patches ago, we were also presented with a dialogue between Yaemiko and A, foreshadowing some sort of a bigger war to which A had no choice but to fight. And if we go back to the talking stick lore, Sunjatta, who was among the 6 allies recruited by Tenoch, expressed his desire for stability, going as far as to expel Tenoch from his tribe for his battle tendency. Similarly, we also know from Vennessa's backstory that her generation has only been inheriting combat and survival techniques rather than their history. So what these imply is that war in itself is natural and cyclical. For Natlan, it's their culture, which as another hot take of mine could be perceived as tragic. Sunjatta has grown tired of the battles and we could see the same disinterest in most revealed characters in the Ignition teaser. It seemed to me as if people in Natlan only existed to fight, and without their tendencies for battles, they would be as good as an empty shell with no color, no name, no identity. War never ends in Natlan. It's always in their nature. It could be where the conflict of the Archon quest would start, or maybe it had something to do with the primal fire, kind of like the primordial sea to the Fontanians. But going back, their wish of stability might constitute the dream in the phrase, burnt to cinders for a dream. So if earning a name would be equivalent to the victors burning bright, then burning to cinders would be the losers turning to ash. Now, I'm not entirely sure if I'm correct, but although cinders and ashes could be synonymous, they have a slight difference in functionality. Ashes is what's left of a completely burned material. Any attempt to light it up again would be futile, because its fire is already extinguished. Cinders, on the other hand, refers to the remaining bits of combustible materials, meaning when ignited, it can create fire again. But here, this is my personal theory. The use of cinders and ashes are mutually independent from each other's context, but both words have something to do with Natlan's main motif, resurrection. Let's go back to ashes. I tried to look for symbolism of ashes for the Mesoamerican civilization, and I happened to come across this information where it says ash and soot are emblematic of renewal from the old and dead, and blur symbolically with bone and maize dough, substances from which new life was made. It then follows with an example based on the Maya hero twin story who quote-unquote, after being burnt in a pit oven, have their bones ground like maize and tossed into a river. This story finds parallel across Mesoamerica, where humanity is crafted either from the mixing of divine blood with the bones of humans of earlier creation, or the mixing of blood and maize dough. Well, now we're in history territory both in real life and in Genshin. There's so much to unpack from that information, so let's start with the ash part first. Ash was said to loosely resemble that of bone and maize dough from which life was made, and it is a symbol of renewal from the old and dead. Is this renewal the same as resurrection? I would say partially because I interpret this in two ways. 1. This renewal is indeed the same as resurrection, where a being is rather reborn than restored back to life. But aren't they the same? Well, not quite. Being reborn could imply an alteration to a being's physical manifestation. In the Ignition teaser, Mavuika was shown to emerge from a phoenix, which is a mythological symbol of renewal and rebirth. There you have it. The words explain themselves. But I believe this also makes sense because Karamush became Wanderer after being turned to ash. He didn't come back to life as Karamush again. Now, the second interpretation is that this renewal has a progressive meaning that implies reimagining what's old and dead. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but it could be a concept or a thing or a belief or a process of reasoning. It could be simplified as adapting tradition to modern times. The next we gotta point out is the Maya hero twins, where it starts with two brothers who were quite adept at playing ball. The conflict rose when the Lords of Death got annoyed by the noise of their ball games, so the Lords of Death invited them to Xibalba, which I believe is like the underworld, for a game of ball in which the brothers doubted the Lords of Death and hid their game equipment. They were tricked into a series of tests in which they failed everything, costing them their lives. One of the brothers turned out to have fathered twins, named Hunapu and Xbalanque. Hey, it's the same guy who made a coat in Monsieur's Drip Marketing. Anyway, the twins turned out to be equally as exceptional as their father and uncle in the games of ball. The events followed until they also went to Xibalba, outsmarting the Lords of Death's tricks. They played ball against the Lords and won, frustrating them even more following an attempt to trick the twins into jumping into an oven. This is where their ashes were tossed into the river, only to be remade into a pair of catfish, then into the form of young boys, in which the Lords couldn't recognize. It was then the twins who were now playing tricks, and at the end, they defeated the Lords. Afterwards, they ascended to the sky with Hunapu becoming the sun and Xbalanque becoming the moon. One thing that struck me here is that the twins' deaths by the oven was planned. They knew this was another trick, so they went with an Uno reverse card, tricking the Lords of Death into thinking that they're already dead. They turned to ash as they appeared as the losers to the Lords. They lost on purpose, or rather, it was their intention to trick the Lords into thinking that they lost. They knew what they were doing. They had the resurrection coming. Now in Genshin, we have already been introduced to Xbalanque through Nouvelette's drip marketing with the title One Entombed with a Primal Fire. Many of you might have been thinking that he's the Pyro Sovereign, but I think that Xbalanque is just a half part of the Pyro Sovereign. Here's the thing, Xbalanque became the moon in the Maya hero twin story. But if we are talking about Natlan, why would they leave out the sun on purpose? This leads me to a sudden theory. The Pyro Sovereign has been split into two entities. One half is already the one entombed with the primal fire. Now where would be the other half? My answer is Mavuika. I know it's a spicy theory, but check this out. Just as I was supposed to explain the last part to unpack, I figured that my explanation as to why Mavuika would have the other half of the Pyro Sovereign is likely connected to this one. See this. Humanity is crafted either from the mixing of divine blood with the bones of humans of earlier creation, or the mixing of blood and maize dough. Does this remind you of an event where humans were created with divine powers? Well, it is indeed when Egeria committed the sin of turning Oceanids into humans, except that it was instead the Oceanids of earlier creation. Another resemblance would be how Melusines come into being through the combination of Elenis's blood and the clockwork mecha components. Well, technically, these clockwork components would be likened to the bones. But what if Natlan is also the same in that regard, where people in Natlan are also born with the help of divine powers? This got me looking back to the topic of Vennessa and her tribe and her classification as a Muratan. Murata was the former and original Pyro Archon, from which the combat arts of Vennessa's tribe likely originated from. Muratan people are also quite distinguishable with their fiery red hair, which also leads me to believe that Mavuika is also a Muratan. This same fiery red hair was their inheritance. The combat arts too were their inheritance, so their wartide existence must have also been their inheritance. Additionally, Nouvelette mentioned that Natlan is the nation of dragons, where they have formed a coexistence with humans. Could it be the same coexistence as the one we have in Fontaine, where humans and Melusines coexist in the present time? Or could it refer to another type of coexistence where Saurian companions are linked to the owners? Besides, in the Nidahan Natlan teaser, we can see the characters use mounts or exploration perks which could likely be tied to the glowing color aura around them. So Natlan's humans were possibly created by the divine power of the rules of war mixed with inhabitants of earlier creation, the Saurians. And if the Phoenix in the Ignition teaser turns out to be a Saurian as well, then I might be onto something something when I say that Mavuika is a manifestation of the divine throne of Pyro mixed with the other half of what makes the Pyro sovereign. Because look at her eyes. It's literally the sun. This would be Hunahpu in the Maya hero twin story. But we've been mentioning Lords of Death a while ago as well as their tricks, and I'd like to bring it back for the last phrase of the gemstone, being if the intention yet remains, achieved truth he has. Here, we encounter the word intention once again. What does this phrase imply for the Lords of Death? Following the burn to cinders for a dream phrase, it implies dichotomous outcomes where if the intention yet remains, you won't be tricked. If you have come face to face with defeat and death, you would still be up and fighting should the intention yet remains. The Lords of Death has been present with the Ashes, as well as the characters that we have associated with it. The forbidden knowledge in Apep's dialogues? Those were trickeries. The 3 betrayals of Scaramouche? Those were also fate playing tricks with him, warping his intention of having a heart. And going back to the last few lines in the Ignition teaser, Mavuika says, "What our eyes see ought to be our fate." It is then followed by, "But now, close your eyes and feel, for which our blood we will forge our true fate." Could these lines pertain to her own reasons as to why she's sharing the secret of war to the Traveler? There have been numerous occasions where fate is being pushed as this enigmatic predetermined force, like with Mage N telling us, if things could be happening where the god's gaze does not fall, are the things you shall see different from the fate that the gods perceive. There is also Farina's teaser where Farina said that, while fate may seem like it's playing cruel jokes on you, only fate will not deceive you. It seems to me that Mavuika knows the secrets behind the perception of fate. What our eyes see ought to be our fate. Indeed, fate does not deceive us, so what we see is basically it. But it's possible that the predetermined fate that we perceive is a fake presenting itself as the truth. So if the rules of war are already woven in the womb, Mavuika telling us to close our eyes and feel is her sharing us her secret that by not seeing fate, we get to be in touch with the yet remaining intention as to why we fight. We get to the bottom of our own rules of war that are instead forged in the womb without outside influences. Those are the intentions that ignites the cinders to burn again. The intention that celebrates losers with another chance of triumph. The intention that fools death, leading us to our inevitable resurrection. I just want to add some of my few additional prediction notes. "Rise, O strong men, and go to your destined victory," is the Latin message that is deciphered from the text below the incandescent Ode to Resurrection title. This strong man could either be the Traveler or the Pyro Sovereign. The Traveler might have an important role to play in the battles, and I do think that there is a possibility that the Traveler will die, or perhaps lose. They would then learn about the secret and inevitably resurrect and claim the victory, setting the standard for the brightest ideal from outside any tribes, abolishing the preconceived birthright of war where people just fight for fighting's sake, rather than for a specific intention. However, I am leaning towards the Pyro Sovereign being the strong man, because it's already their destiny to inhabit Teyvat and they've been quite the losers for quite a long time. If the secret behind the war has been realized, we could learn about the truth of the Pyro Sovereign, whose name is possibly obscured in the agate gemstone, which is also why battles are being held for a name. But I do think that it's also possible that Mavuika will give up her powers to resurrect the Pyro Sovereign and to renew his name. Capitano has been presented as the favorite to win in this tournament, and even though he's only there for the Gnosis, battles that involve him would be of great importance, because losing against him, likely for Mavuika or the Traveler, might trigger anything that we talked about in regards to Ashes and the secrets of war. Winning against him might reveal more about the nature of winning in war. Also, before I forget, the Ignition teaser had this short excerpt from its description. It says, "O God of fire, infernos, and war, your fate forged amid strife, your path paved in glory in names renowned, your radiance resembles the setting sun's might. Under the assembled stars' flames we gather to bear witness to the triumphs and defeats of this tournament." I think this one is already quite obvious. The setting sun's might could point to Mavuika giving up something or conceding something or stepping down from authority, possibly to return the power to the Pyro Sovereign. Under the assembled stars' flames we gather could point out to the 6 tribes which symbols are in flames at the end of the teaser. Then we have to bear witness to the triumphs and defeats of this tournament, which, if you paid attention a few seconds back to where we see the 6 tribe symbols, Mavuika said, "Time to burn again. Even the tiniest of sparks will not go unnoticed." This could be the incandescent part, where the cinders of those who lost their fighting spirit would be ignited again, in a way that all who have won and lost will begin fighting for a shared intention, instead of fighting amongst each other just for battle's sake. That could explain why all the tribe symbols are burning in flames, unlike what we saw in the 4.7 Natlan teaser where the symbols light up in colors to their corresponding element. For the meantime, give yourselves a high five because there's always more to discover with Deep Dive. I'm Mercanique, and this is my verdict. Thanks for watching.
Oratrice Mercanique d'analyse cardinal. 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 Oratrice Mercanique d'analyse cardinal.